Hello and welcome back to Particular Pixels. I'm Xiaoling, and in this video we are going to be taking a look at Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning. The original Kingdoms of Amalur was released back in 2012, and while it certainly wasn't perfect, it was an enjoyable experience that left me with some fond memories. So naturally, when they announced the Re-Reckoning a few months ago, I was pretty excited to get my hands on the game and see what had been changed or improved since the vanilla release. So first up, we have improved graphical fidelity in Re-Reckoning. The shaders have been slightly improved and the textures are a little bit cleaner. I do believe the game uses DirectX 11 now instead of DirectX 9. Unfortunately, the changes are barely noticeable and they come at a significant performance cost in most locations. This became apparent as soon as I reached the first town, Gorhart. The frame rate dropped to the mid-60s at 1080p from over 120 frames a second when looking directly at the town, and I'm using an RTX 2070 Super. I do own the original game, so I was able to load into the same locations and compare both the visual changes and the performance differences between the versions. The same location in the vanilla yielded 144 frames, which is my monitor's maximum refresh rate. The lower than vanilla frame rate issues are prevalent throughout the entire remaster, but are most noticeable, at least most severe, in certain towns, certain dungeons, and a few outdoor areas, whereas the vanilla game managed to maintain 100 to 144 frames a second in all of these locations. There were also instances where the frame rate would actually dip into the mid-50s in certain dungeons, and setting the game to the absolute lowest details improved the performance slightly, but not by that much. For example, one of the towns that has a very low FPS at around 55 to 59, and on the lowest setting that went up to around 69. So, inevitably after a few hours, I kept asking myself why exactly I would actually choose to play a game that barely looks any different than the original for such a massive performance hit. There are far better looking games that run far better as well, even at 4K, and Death Stranding comes to mind. Those of you with slower than RTX 2070 supercards are likely going to have issues maintaining 60 frames a second in these areas of this new version. In addition, the cutscenes have also not received any changes, so when played side by side they are identical, and the low quality is more easily noticeable because of the slight graphical changes in the remastered version. Next up, we have 4K support. The remaster supports 4K. I guess that would be expected for any game that comes out nowadays, which for those of you who are hoping to play the game at this resolution is good news. The bad news, however, is that you're probably going to need a 2080 Ti or one of the new Ampere cards to get a smooth 60 frames a second experience. 4K on my 2070 Super was not able to get 60 in many locations and sat around 45 frames a second. In contrast, the vanilla version in those same locations in 4K maintained over 100 frames a second. In fact, the frame rates at 4K in the vanilla version were actually higher than many of the areas in the remastered 1080p. So yeah, just let that sink in for a moment. Unfortunately, the issue with the vanilla at 4K is that the UI becomes so small and hard to read, it's not really practical to play that way. Next up, we have the UI. The remaster does offer three options for UI scale: default, small, and hidden. Now, while this sounds great on paper, the issue is that the default health bars and hotbars were too large for my liking, but on the small setting, the minimap was too small. I am not sure why they didn't give the player the option of either dynamically scaling the entire UI or allowing the player to scale each part independently. I don't imagine it would have been that difficult to implement. In addition, the Re-Reckoning has opted to change the enemy markers on the minimap to circles rather than the more useful arrowhead icons found in the vanilla for some reason. Next, when it comes to inventory, the original was cumbersome for sure, as those of you who have played it before will probably remember. This aspect of the game hasn't gotten any attention whatsoever, so it's basically identical to the vanilla, and I think it could really have used some quality of life changes. There's no filter to sort the long list of items by rarity type or anything like that. You can add items to junk and then mass sell them all to the vendor, but you'll need to add each item one at a time. There's no way to tag a bunch of items together to either discard or add them all to junk. If your inventory is full in the middle of a dungeon or you're exploring, you'll need to painfully delete one item at a time. The same issue exists when crafting potions or moving items to your stash. It's always one at a time. This is time consuming and it's somewhat annoying. Now, this wouldn't really be a massive issue, but Amalur is a loot-based RPG with crafting, so you're going to end up with tons of materials and items in your inventory. I would have expected at least to have some work to be put into improving this area. Next up, we have game balance and the numbers. The official statement is that there have been balance changes and an added difficulty level in the game in the form of very hard. In the vanilla, it was really easy to outlevel areas and end up being far too powerful far too early in the game, since the zones were level based like an MMO. But now the enemies will scale within a certain range of the player when you enter an area depending on the difficulty that you are playing on. They've also said in reply to a YouTube comment on one of their trailer videos where someone was commenting on the very few small unnoticeable changes of the remaster that most of the changes went into the numbers. They can't really explain it, but that would feel the difference. After 40 hours of playing through this, I can honestly say I can't feel any difference from when I played through the vanilla game. Now, it's possible, look, that I'm not noticing the changes since it's been so long since I played the original, but if there are any changes, they seem to be pretty minor at best, and even on hard, the game is still pretty easy. Moving on to bugs, I believe they fixed numerous bugs that were present in the original. Which ones I can't say for sure because I never came across many when I played the original. What I will say though, there are still several bugs present in the game. There were several NPC dialog windows that had camera issues, so you can see on the image on the screen. And I had around 4 crashes that required restarting the game. And there were occasional graphics glitches in various places in the game where geometry would just pop in and disappear, stuff like that. The anisotropic setting doesn't seem to do much either. I guess it's either broken or poorly implemented. I'm not sure. I basically had to resort to using the anisotropic setting from my NVIDIA control settings for it to work correctly. And finally, if all the frame rate issues we discussed earlier weren't enough, there were several instances where the frame rate would just tank for no apparent reason at all to 15 to 30 and just stay there. And this required me to basically exit the area and re-enter it for it to rectify itself. Although thankfully this was not all that common. Now, briefly talking about the game itself, as I said earlier in the review, Kingdoms of Amalur is a very enjoyable action RPG, but not without issues. The gaming landscape has evolved quite a lot over the last 8 years, which unfortunately highlights some of the weaknesses that are present that may not have been so easily noticeable back when the vanilla was released in 2012. There are also still tons of loading screens every time you travel between zones or enter a building, and that happens a lot, by the way. So even on an SSD, it's going to start getting tiresome. The load times aren't particularly long, but they are constant. In addition to barely changing anything visually, because the game still looks incredibly dated, this remaster does nothing to address the many of the UI issues that were present in the vanilla game, or fix or adjust any of the skills that seem to have little impact on the game at all, and make them more meaningful, and I'm talking about lockpicking and stealth and stuff like that. Kingdoms of Amalur is still a good game though, and despite the poor optimization, which is my main gripe with this remaster, I still played through the entire main story arc. It took me around 35 to 40 hours to finish, but I didn't finish the DLCs for this particular review. However, as it stands at the moment though, if you already own Kingdoms of Amalur, there's absolutely no reason to purchase the Re-Reckoning. You can get exactly the same experience with the vanilla version and at a better frame rate to boost. If you don't own the vanilla game, then this would probably be the version to get, I guess, but even then I'd still suggest you wait for a sale, because I think that the asking price of $40 is way too much for what is essentially a re-release of the same game with barely any changes and worse performance. Owners of the original game on Steam have been offered a 50% discount for 2 months. I'm not sure why it's not permanent, which is some consolation, I suppose. But like me, if you own the game on another platform like Origin, for example, you're flat out of luck and you're going to be expected to pay full price for the same game all over again. To me, this remaster is low effort, and it shows. It appears to be more of a cash grab than a labor of love, and the result is an incredibly disappointing revisiting of a game that I have fond memories of. It's such a wasted opportunity, to be honest. Kingdoms of Amalur really deserved a better remaster. Anyway, if you guys have any questions or comments, you can leave them in the comment section below. Let me know what your thoughts are if you have played the game. And that about wraps it up. Thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I've been Xiaoling. Until next time.